Go ahead, Kathleen.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. We'd like to welcome you all to our March 2023 session of our Erie County Workforce Collaborative Training Series. The Erie County Department of Mental Health is happy to be able to offer these trainings to the dedicated providers in our community so we can support workforce retention and provide opportunities for individuals from our provider community to share their expertise. Today, we are excited to have Christopher Frigon, LCSW and Senior Therapist from Horizon Health Services with us again to speak on the art of talk therapy, development of your therapeutic style. At the end of this session, we will be asking you to complete a very brief evaluation. We hope that you will take a minute to fill us out so that we can continue to improve. We are also excited to announce that in April, we are actually offering 2 trainings. The first will be Wednesday, April 12th from 12 noon until 1 p.m. on making a care management and SPO referral. And our presenter will be Andrea Tobias with Erie County Department of Mental Health, our assistant coordinator too from SPOA. Please note that this is a Wednesday, not our typical Tuesday. So that is Wednesday, April 12th. The second training in April will be on Tuesday, April 25th from 12 noon until 1 on barriers to reentry with Juliana Everdyke from Erie County Department of Mental Health. She is our Director of Dual Recovery and Community Integration, who will be presenting along with Lindsay Allen, Director of Community Programs with Project Blue and Empower Youth at Peace Prince of West New York, and Tanya Drake, our Erie County Reentry Task Force Coordinator. And this is our regularly scheduled Tuesday. We are also excited that in May, Melinda Dubois, MSW from Mental Health Advocates, their executive director, will be joining us for an excellent presentation on self-care, the mind-body connection. This will be Tuesday, May 23rd from 12 noon until 1 p.m. We will put the link for the April registration or the registration for the April sessions in our chat here at the end of this session. We will also be sending out announcements, but you can always go to our erie.gov/mental health website for our training announcements and registration information. Registration links for all 3 of these upcoming trainings is posted there already. Encourage everyone to please share this information with your coworkers, colleagues, other providers in the community, and encourage them to attend. We have great presenters coming up that have a wealth of knowledge to share, so we'd encourage everyone to spread the word. Most of our sessions are the 4th Tuesday of the month from noon to 1 p.m. So we'd encourage you to mark your calendars and watch for future notices. All of our presentations and recordings for our past offerings are posted on our website, so you can check those out as well. Again, this is a community collaborative. We're always looking for volunteers to share their expertise with our community of providers. If you are interested in doing a 1-hour presentation, or if you're interested in a particular topic, you can indicate that on your evaluation and/or contact Amy. Her email is amy.rockwood@erie.gov. This training will be recorded. Everyone is muted, so if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. I'll be monitoring the chat during the presentation, and Chris will be answering questions as we go along. Thank you for joining us today, and I'd like to introduce Christopher Frigon for his presentation on the art of talk therapy, development of your therapeutic style. Thank you again so much for joining us, Chris. It's all yours.
Well, thank you for having me on. And really thank you, Amy and Kathleen, for the invite. I appreciate it. This work is my passion. I love talking about it. And just maybe it's worth talking about where this presentation came from. There's a conversation with Amy and Kathleen about stuff like what would be interesting. And one of the 2 of you had mentioned about retention, workforce retention. And I had not realized that your series, your Lunch and Learn series, was really based on that idea, like retaining the workforce. And I thought that's amazing. So I went on one of these weird little rants that I go on from time to time, just about how I do my work. And something I was saying caught your attention, and you said, let's do a talk on that. And I thought, well, I've had these talks informally over the years about what is it that we do, like what do counselors do, what a therapist do, what makes our work special. And why do we keep doing it for as long as we do? And one of the most influential people to my way of thinking about this, by the way, came from a guy who, just as I was getting into the field in terms of education, graduate school, it was a guy leaving the field and opening up a restaurant. He loved to cook. So I said, why would you leave? And he said, Chris, I got to be honest with you. 10 years of suicides, I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't do it. I love working with people, but this was not where I was going to get like long-term satisfaction. And I thought, well, that's really interesting, and I really appreciated his honesty about that. And then I thought, well, why do people stay for as long as they do? And over the years of talking to supervisors, colleagues, mentors, I've arrived at no original ideas, but I've collected ideas I believe that work for me. So part of the what I would hope to give to anybody who's watching today would be the idea of how to keep yourself fresh and new in the field. How do I do that? I'm not saying that's how you're going to do it, but I can talk about how I've done it, at least to a degree, within the hour, and then go over some very specific ideas. And the frame that I use most recently in my career has been what I call social cliches. So I want to go through kind of some foundational stuff and then get to the cliches that I like to kind of play with. What is engagement in talk therapy? Well, we need to talk about what is clinical authority and maybe what is it not. What is authenticity? I can only be who I am. You can only be who you are, obviously, right? But the application of these ideas, because my idea is I don't want to sound like a book. Some of the best compliments I've ever gotten from people I've worked with over the years are versions of that. You sound real. You don't sound like a book. Like, you're relatable. And I thought, well, interesting, because how would you know that unless someone's telling you that, really? Because that's about the relationship. And then we'll go over some specific social cliches. And I'll be clear about some of them because as I've played with them over the years and evolved them, some turned out to be, frankly, garbage, and I needed to dig a hole in the backyard and bury them and forget all about them. And some of them I keep playing with over and over again. And the more I get responses, like positive responses from people I work with, the more I tend to keep evolving these things. And this is about retention, is the evolving of ideas. So where do they come from? Well, my very first, I would say, clinical mentor in the field, her name is Jane. And she had this quote as I'm sitting in her office talking about a particularly difficult case for myself, because I felt like unvoiced. I didn't know how to say things to this person. She said, Chris, you've got to remember there's two of you in the room. Now, this is one-on-one therapy, not couples or group, and that has never left me. There's two of us in the room. There's two of us in the room. What does that possibly mean? Well, it means active listening is talking. It isn't just sitting and being passive. That's been my interpretation for years about how do you engage with folks in terms of having them value the time that you spend with them. And some of it's, yes, your style, your originality, but it is taking your knowledge that they are coming and seeking you out for specifically, not because you have to be an expert, on day one from graduate school, but because you have this level of knowledge that folks do not have. And you see it in the real world, by the way. Just pause and consider for a minute, how often or frequently do you see people that you know professionally, but more likely personally, or even in Hollywood, like movies and TV, well, they will observe a behavior and go, oh my God, that person's so bipolar. They don't have a clue what they're talking about, but they think they do because they have a little bit of this kind of awareness of what bipolar disorder might be. So they label it in a way they think makes them understandable and relatable to you. But we know it just isn't so. That's not how bipolar disorder presents in our worlds. So we do a lot of education from our knowledge base, but also from our experience. And speaking of that, that's why I put this thing up here about clients, consumers, clients, patients. Look, whatever people want to be called, I'm happy with that. I have forever just called people clients because when I entered the field, that's what they were called. So I never called anybody a consumer, and I don't call them patients today. But if somebody says they want to be called a patient, fine, whatever. That's not where clinical authority lies. Clinical authority is that person saying, you have information between your ears, Chris, that I need to make my life be different. Cool. How do I get that information out of my head and into theirs? Well, use your knowledge. But let's be clear about something. Social cliche number one. As a kid growing up, I remember this series of like public service announcements that would be on TV back when you had like 4 TV channels you could choose from, 3, 5, 9, and 24. in my hometown, right? So there would be this thing, stars would come across some celebrity's head and would say, the more you know, right? And it would say like some factoid to empower you. Well, knowledge is not power. That's a lie. Knowledge is a tool. I would absolutely buy that. But what is powerful is the accurate application of that tool. So while I may have this hammer in my hand, it's just a tool. And if I misuse it, it's not power. That's abuse, right? So I want to be clear about that. Knowledge is not power. But the collection of knowledge and the accurate application of it, which is where we're going to go when we talk about social cliches and why I like playing with them. The last point I want to make clear, supervision, the place to explore your personal style and working with people on a professional level is in supervision. Make sure you've got a sounding board to talk this stuff out with. Otherwise, it's real easy to go off the deep end quick and not even know it's happening. Like, you need your guardrails. So I will always say, with a very strong caveat, however you're developing your professional style working with people, you really need to be talking with people. You're a supervisor or a group of colleagues, whatever your access is, and whatever your format, by the way, because this obviously isn't just for people who do talk therapy. It's for case managers and how you are interacting with individuals, for nurses, doctors, right? Having the ability to evolve your style isn't just by being in your own head and watching how people react to you, because people are, generally speaking, going to engage in the social acceptability bias, to mean they're not going to tell you about yourself until they have a relationship with you that gives them the foundation to do that. So you need to rely on someone for yourself who's also a little neutral to tell you, yeah, Chris, that idea isn't really a strong one. You should maybe move in a different direction. To be clear, this goes back to Jane. Early in my career, I thought she gave me a compliment. I didn't realize that it truly wasn't for some time. And I had just gotten out of the Air Force, gone to school, come to work for Jane. And one day we're talking about something. He said, Chris, you don't suffer fools. And I thought, yeah, she gets me right on. And then, I don't know, like a little while later, I was like, oh, wait a minute. She just called me arrogant. And I didn't realize she had done it. That's how subtle and smooth that was. And I took it and I came back to her and I said, Jane, thank you. Thank you. This is what we do in talk therapy, the art of using language to find a way to make a point. And Jane would also often talk about planting seeds, that we're not expecting, that in the 1 hour talk therapy session, at the end of it, the person we're talking with is going to have these momentous insights and radical change. No, we need to have the expectation of timing and how long things can take. So we'll talk a bit about that too as we move along. So what is being authentic? Well, you be you, I'll be me. And that means this. To put it, I think, frankly and simply, in this format, I'm going to self-monitor and I will not use language that I would otherwise use, being the authentic me. I have a daughter, she's 20 years old. We have a rule. She can swear in the house, in my house with me, and in my car, nowhere else. Cannot happen. And one day I got a note from school that she broke the rule. Okay, I will face that consequence, right? That's us being authentic and real. We can self-monitor because we need to be our genuine selves, not me and her, but all of us, right? But we need to have the ability to take a look at who we're working with and know what language will land with those folks. This is the art. This is the art of talking with people and understanding relationships. And it isn't about necessarily respecting certain things, but it's about kind of understanding what is in fact going to be a conversation that can land and make meaning for someone. So we're going to adjust, is my point, from person to person, situation to situation. So timing matters here too when we consider things. When can you ask things? When can you say things? Right away or much, much later? This was an observation from a doctor that I worked with. Some of you might know Dr. Richard Wolin. He had made this comment at a case conference, just kind of off the cuff. He said, what's really interesting about assessment is you can ask pretty much anybody, pretty much anything you want the first time you talk to them. But if you don't ask them, you might not be able to get to it until many, many months later. And I thought about that and said, that's such an interesting observation. What is that about? Well, to me, it goes back to the assumption of your clinical authority. So if people are hearing you ask them questions, most likely they're assuming that you are asking for a really, really good reason. And if you don't ask, well, they might assume you're not asking also for a good reason. And then it just becomes contextualized later. Like, how do you fit in the question about what happened to your cat when you were 4? If you didn't ask about that at visit 1, how do you ask about that at visit 2? Like, it might not make contextual sense, but it might be important to figure that out. So how do you bring it up? My habit is to use what I call the check a box kind of conversation. Like, hey, look, there's a couple of areas we didn't get to talk about yet. Let me check a couple of boxes with you, right? And this is my way of saying this is totally a non sequitur. Like, it doesn't attach to anything we talked about, but I can't let it not be talked about. And when I finish an assessment, when I've got, a good 5-10 minutes left, I will ask people, is there anything we didn't get to talk about today yet that you want to make sure we have covered or that I'm aware of? This is the rounding out, right? So that I'm not simply walking through an assessment tool and asking questions that a piece of paper or a form is telling me to ask. I don't want to sound like that. I want to sound like someone the person wants to have a conversation with. To go back again to kind of like a little age thing here. Some of you might remember computer software, which was MS-DOS, DOS. This was an operating system like from when was it? 1990s, early 90s. And of all things, there was a program called Dr. Sbaitso, Sbaitso. I don't know why I remember this, but Dr. Sbaitso was like a very early kind of an AI. And it was a talk therapist. And you would just type in questions to Dr. Sbaitso. And it would spit back these very book type answers, And it was funny, and you could play with it and, do off-color things, of course, and it would respond to you. But I think about that in my own head. Don't be Dr. Sbaitso. Like, be something fairly off the cuff, which is part of, frankly, what makes today's talk for me a little threatening, frankly, emotionally, because I don't talk about this stuff through PowerPoints. I've never done that before. It's always been off the cuff stuff. So I wanted to format it obviously for our meeting purpose, but I also wanted to feel like this is an organic conversation. To reflect back to the original conversation with Colleen and Amy, it just came out of nothing. It spawned. And this to me is also part of understanding the art of talk therapy. If you think about how conversation works, it's all totally random, but most people engage in what's called cooperative communication. Whatever topic I bring up, you are likely to respond to, right? It's just how people interact. So the more you do talk therapy, the more you start to realize I could start the conversation anywhere and it's going to begin there. So where do we choose to begin conversations with? This also is part of the art. How do you remember what you talked about last week with the person you're with now versus the other 29 people that you talked with? How do you recall that? What is your mechanism for that? Well, I think art has a lot to say about that. How we recall, emotionally, call it information that's emotionally important to these conversations with people. The last point on here about being authentic, this is my style. Yes, I do believe in the science of talk therapy. There's a place for it, meaning the measurement of observable phenomena. I think that's important, but I don't think it's the most important thing. And frankly, I think it's way overemphasized with PHQs and GAD-7s. A personal experience with walking into my doctor's office many years ago and filling out the PHQ, and I did it tongue in cheek. I wasn't serious about it because I knew what it was. It's not labeled; it's just this questionnaire. And the nurse takes my paperwork back, and I talk to my doctor, and I walk out, and it was never even addressed. Like, it was never addressed. So why am I scaling the fact that I identified myself as having major depression without suicide? That's what I did. Like, I just answered these questions. I wanted to see where it would go. And it never got brought up. So I thought, well, wow, what's the point? That's just weird. But it's a thing, right? And I know what it lends itself to. It lends itself to, cynically, the doctor billing for an assessment that was done that I did on myself. And I thought, well, geez, yeah, I don't really have much use for that. Now, there are behavioralists out there in this group today that will use those and use them really, really well. That's great. That is your style. That's your art and how you do that. I'm just always really cautious about how people interpret things like more days than not, some more than other. Like, I don't find a whole ton of value in that, but I'm not really wired to think that way either. So science, yes, but for me, my style, limited. Okay, theory, application of theory. I talk about theory quite a bit because it is the foundation. Like, where do your ideas spring from? And while some of them have, clear validity over time, others do not. Wink, wink, nod, nod. Freud, like, he had a couple of interesting things to say, but over time, I think we've kind of come to realize a lot of that stuff was so, centered on a particular time and place. The psychoanalysts out there right now are like punching me in the face. I get it. But look, for most of us, most of the time, we don't have the ability to do that kind of work. Free association on a couch without looking at someone is an interesting way of doing work. I just don't have that luxury. In my real world, what I have the luxury of doing is understanding a little bit some of the concepts and then teaching a little bit what ego really means and what is it and what is superego. So that's it, like the depth that I would go with analytic theory for me personally. But I want that to inform other ways of approaching things. I've always been heavily impressed by existential therapy, reality therapy, like William Glasser's version of that. Like, it's not about being optimistic or pessimistic. It's about being real with people. And I think when you start with that approach, you're almost automatically inclined to not speak out of a textbook. And by speaking out of a textbook, I mean this very subtly. When we talk about working maybe psychotherapy, we want to teach people concepts. So we might say things like, let's talk about I statements. If you want to be assertive, we need to learn I statements. Look, as soon as you say that to me as my therapist, like, my eyelids are getting heavy. Like, not because I don't want to hear what you had to say, but because I can't learn that way. So what I do when I teach people I statements is I role model them and I just use them. I say them, right? And then I will backtrack and say, the way I just spoke with you, by the way, which most people, when I do it, I will use I statements and I'll check in with them. So how did that feel to hear what I just said? I'll go, that felt good. That was validating. Nice. Those are called I statements. So I don't tell them what we're going to do. I do it and then tell them. This is how to not speak like, to sound like you don't want to sound like a book. You just want to sound like a person having a conversation. Because remember, cooperative communication. All these approaches, and I can't speak to like theory outside of talk therapy, so case management, nursing, I can't speak to what theories would drive those kind of conversations. Although I do know things like motivational interviewing tend to influence all of them, which is fine. Whatever your approach is, use it, but evolve it, I think is my point, right? So I've never formally learned motivational interviewing, but I was talking with a supervisor years ago. I was working in a drug and alcohol rehab, and she made some comment about a theory. And I said, I got to be honest, I don't know what you're talking about. And she says, oh, that's from motivational interviewing. And I said, okay, like, I don't really know anything about that. And she said, well, what you're doing is rolling with resistance. And I said, oh, okay. I didn't know there was like a phrase for that, because all I was doing was not having conversation about a barrier that a person was putting up about a thing that we were trying to work on, right? I just don't do barrier talk. To me, it sounded all victim-y. Sorry, that's my like thing with clients when they're victim in victim land, like, I throw my fingers up. But that's a stylistic thing, and they already know ahead of time when I'm going to do it and why I do it. Victim is over here, voice is over here. So I hear this victim stuff, and I just don't engage it. And said, well, that's called rolling with resistance. Cool. So I picked up a book on motivational interviewing. It's around here somewhere. And I read through it and I thought, well, okay, yep, I do some of that stuff, but I don't like the language. It felt too stilted and formal. And we'll talk about self-help in a minute and how I incorporate some of that stuff. Self-disclosure. I include this as part of supervision when it comes to evolving your style, because I think there's some mythology out there about self-disclosure that I like to challenge. And this is really heavily where supervision matters a lot. Because what is self-disclosure? I remember graduate school and being told, when a client asks you about your personal life, you are to respond to them with some version of this. This is about you, not about me. And I remember hearing that as a student and thinking, that's a really funny way to punch somebody in the face. Like, who would ever want to hear that? So then I get experienced a little bit, meaning like I'm on the job 6 months and it happens, people are asking me if I'm Catholic, if I have kids, if I'm like, it just comes out of conversation, for crying out loud. One guy even very astutely asked me how I liked living in Orchard Park, because at the time I did. And my eyes got real big and he laughed, this big old hearty laugh. He goes, I'm just messing with you. And I said, well, how'd you know that? Because I'm in my head thinking stalker, 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 right? Like, no, it turns out that the license that I have on the wall in my office, which I never really paid attention to, has my home address on it, like from New York State. It's printed right in there. And he just pointed at it and goes, it's right there. God. So I self-disclosed without knowing it. And in that moment, I realized, you know what? Why are we taking this self-disclosure thing so seriously? Well, it matters to think about it, but what is self-disclosure? In the art of talk therapy, self-disclosure is using your own experience about life and telling stories in a way that makes you relatable to your client. Now, there's this thing too about school where they tell you, like, you don't need to be liked by your clients. I don't disagree with that. We don't need to be liked, but I can't lie, it sure helps. Like, there's a vehicle there, like, and it isn't about liking on a personal level. It's liking because of relatability and understandability, right? So I don't need to ever like the therapist I've worked with over time, but as a client of theirs, I can't help but acknowledge, like, when that feeling is there, there's a kind of a connection that you don't get. And I've had one experience with someone that I thought, there's no way I'm telling this person jack about me. Like, their approach was just so, like, I don't know, removed and distant and emotionally unavailable. Couldn't do it. Now, they might be perfectly fine for somebody else. Like Bill Burr, the stand-up comic, I also cannot stand people that come at me with, well, how'd that make you feel? Man, I don't want that soft touch. That doesn't work for me. That has never been my personal style. So evolving to understanding that and having a kind of confidence in oneself and one's approach to know this. Jane, or well, not early in my career, maybe 10 years in, she was giving me feedback about, Chris, you might need to work on your nurturing approach a little bit. And I thought about that a lot, right? Because by then I'm married, I've got kids, and I think I'm a pretty nurturing, parent. But am I not nurturing with clients? Like, how is she arriving at that conclusion? Thought about it and thought about it and thought about it. And I came back eventually and I talked to her and I said, like, how'd you arrive at that? And she said, well, you tend to be pretty intellectualized when you're having your conversations with your clients. You're asking them to think a lot rather than like emote or talk about their feelings. That was not an uninformed observation. It's how I presented cases. It's how she heard me on tape. Like, okay. So I took a look at it. And eventually I came back to her and I said, hey, I got a question for you. What if I just can't do that? That thing about nurturing? What if that's like not my thing? She goes, well, then embrace it. Like, you need to be you and your authentic self. You can't be something you're not, but look at it and grow if you can. And I could, so I did a little, but it wasn't worth my time to think I need to be this thing that I'm not. So being real and using self-disclosure in terms of my emotional connection with people. I've got a million stories that I use to relate with people on. And it's about taking a moment into not just a teachable moment, but a connection moment for clients, right? The last piece here about manipulation, I want to be clear about what manipulation is. I'm just going to steal a definition straight from Marsha Linehan. She is, of course, the author of Dialectical Behavioral Therapy, a treatment protocol she devised for the treatment of borderline personality disorder. And she defined manipulation like this, and she took it right out of a dictionary. She said manipulation is a pre-planned or cunning attempt to get someone to do something they wouldn't ordinarily do otherwise, often with nefarious intent. I've never forgot that definition. And there's a couple of key words that stick out. The most important one to me is that word often, referring to nefarious intent. Often doesn't mean always. How interesting. So what might be manipulation that is not with nefarious intent? Well, I'll give you two great examples because we've all done them. One is talk therapy and one is teaching. These are all pre-planned cunning attempts to get people to do things they wouldn't ordinarily do otherwise. Our goals are simply good. We hopefully, I believe my goals to be positive for folks whether it's teaching or whether it's doing talk therapy, but truly getting people to think about things in different ways. This is, of course, the goal of talk therapy, change. So our goal is by nature positive manipulation. So there's a little cliche to look at. What is our natural resistance to that word? Why is has such a negative connotation? Well, because it tends to be overused in that one particular negative way. And by the way, often applied to a diagnosis inappropriately. That's a story for a different day. Social cliche. So there's categories of social cliches. I had forgotten about number one here. I think I'd be a little tone deaf to do point one, given what happened yesterday. So we're going to skip that one. We're going to go right to waiting for the other shoe to drop. I hear this a lot. If you work with people with anxiety, they often have this mantra about, I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? They're anticipating the next bad event. So my reframe for that particular social cliche is to say, of course it's going to drop. Everybody's going to have a shoe drop. Life is living between the shoes. Just thinking about it that way, right? Like, we can't be constantly in anticipation of a shoe that's going to drop, because again, they're going to drop. And if you look back over your life, you've gotten over every single shoe. So let's start living between the shoes. I said it once to a couple, and the lady responded back to me that she was going to embroider that on her pillow. Hey, cool. Good for you. Why is that last part important? Because the talk therapy is art. That wasn't the first time I had said life is living between the shoes, but it was darn near it, right? And it made such an impact on her that her response made an impact on me, and I keep using it. Evolving the art. So that ended up being one that did not find itself in a hole in the backyard. Marriage's work is a fairly new one for me, and I started playing with it. I've worked with couples, honestly, for, since my my second year internship, so well over 20 years. And I've continually evolved my approach, but I've stayed fairly close to certain concepts, most of them being John and Julie Gottman's work, right, around the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, if you're familiar. So without detail, but revolves around that kind of stuff. And some other ancillary ideas, a bank account model, which I can talk about. But marriage's work. Somebody said it to me, it had to be, well, I've been in this space for 3 years now, thanks to COVID. It was definitely within this 3-year space where I heard this. And for whatever reason in that moment, I don't think I showed it, but it irked me because it was said in a way that I could only interpret as a barrier to wanting to do couples therapy. And I forget which partner said it, not that it really matters, but it was clearly communicated as a means of just not engaging. And what jumped out of my mouth was unplanned, unrehearsed. I said, no, marriage is not work, marriage is play. And if you approach it any other way, of course you're going to resist it. It just came out, right? And the couple looked at me and they go, what do you mean? Well, I went on a rant. And I said, well, what do I mean? I mean, like, who wants to go to work all day and then come home and go to work? That sounds stupid, doesn't it? And they started laughing about that. Like, yeah, that is kind of stupid. And I said, yeah, you know what I think? It was some bitter old guy, divorced 3 times. Said, marriage is work. Like, who wants to listen to that guy? I don't. I don't know if there's validity in that opinion. This is just me ranting with a client, and they're laughing. We're laughing together. And one of them said, marriage is play, isn't it? And I said, I think so. Like, when you were dating, did you really think about going to work on a date? That sounds really weird to me. Didn't you go on the date because you wanted to play with that person, go have fun, like laugh together, do interesting things? And yeah. And it's just picked up steam over time. So I've added to the idea of the social cliche, marriage is work, and just playing with the inverse. And by the way, that's kind of the lesson with all of these cliches. When I hear a social cliche, whether it's in session with somebody, in my own head, because, I don't know, I just have thoughts in my head, watching it on a movie, whenever I hear these things, I'm in the habit now of trying to immediately play with the inverse. What is the opposite? And does the opposite of this idea have any validity to it? And maybe does it actually have any greater weight and value than the original version? So I play with it and play with it. One that a client taught me was this one. At least my class was taught that the therapeutic office is a safe a safe space for your clients. They come there, talk about painful things, and they need to know that your office is a safe space. So I believe that, and I don't disbelieve it entirely, but there's a reframe to it that a client had taught me, gotta be 10 years ago. He came, and I'd worked with him for maybe a year at this point, and he comes in one day, sits down, and he's talking about something. He looks at me and he goes, "By the way, your office is not safe. I just want you to know that. It's a laboratory to me. Like, I come here to experiment with what it feels like to say things that I don't normally say in front of people." And what he was talking about was being abused by his parents. Big old family secret because of many reasons. And he was taking enormous risks, but by no means did he feel safe. I've never forgotten that. And I've, from that point forward, tried to never make that assumption again, that the space that we offer people, whether it's virtual or real, is not inherently safe to them. So I've considered that. And how does that affect my approach, right, with talking with people, just by not making the assumption that people are safe? But it's a laboratory. Cool. The reframe, feelings aren't facts. I hear that a lot. It often comes from a well-intended kind of self-help idea. Well, I got bad news for the feelings aren't facts people. Feelings are facts. They're just transient. They come and go, and very often they overlap. You have overlapping facts that often contradict each other. It comes up later, but there's a memory mnemonic. My very educated mother just served us 9 pizzas, and we'll talk about why that's important in a minute. But let's start with the fact that that was a fact, all of it, and then part of it now is not a fact for a very interesting reason. But we still have that mnemonic. And by we, I mean the nerdier group of us. I don't know if everybody knows that. I did not know it in high school. I wish I did. It would have helped. I learned it later in life. Check this one out. This is one of my favorites of all time because it was one of the most humbling conversations I ever had with somebody. This idea you have to love yourself first in order to love another person. That never really struck me as like off in any particular way because I believe there's value in it. But I remember talking to a young woman in early recovery, and we're just talking about something, and she said, "You know, Chris, I got to be honest. I never knew love until I held my first baby for the very first time, and I fell in love immediately. And right then I knew, like I knew what was missing from me to love other people and myself too, because I've hated myself my whole life." And this conversation went on and on and on. But what struck me was, wait a minute, she loved someone else before loving herself. That's how that order of operations worked for her. I've never forgotten that one either. So this idea you have to love yourself first, there is value for some people in that idea, but I also think it hangs other people out to dry because they don't know how to do it. They don't know what it feels like. And you can't teach someone necessarily what that emotion is like. It's kind of like you have to feel it, right? It's why a lot of people resist John Gray and the men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or whichever genders from whichever planet, I forget. But they resist his model because, to be honest, when he wrote the book, like he was a recently retired Catholic priest who'd never been in a relationship. Like, so take that to its extent. Like, how far does that go? If you've never been in a relationship, what are you talking about? Kind of. There's like no validity to the ideas. So of course, that person is relying on ideas that he was told by other people, unchallenged. Now, he did do work with couples through his church, which is fine, but he wrote the book based on that experience. It just has limited validity, frankly. Like this idea, you have to love yourself first. There's some limitation to that. All right, commas and clarification. Social cliche, money can't buy you happiness. This is kind of a well-known and well-worn counter to this cliche, which basically goes like this. You know, money can't buy you happiness. Well, that's true, but the absence of it can absolutely cause misery. Let's be real about that. So when people do the social cliche about countering people's desire for wealth, and I just want to be real with that. Like, who doesn't want to be financially secure? And if that's represented as wealth for a person, and that represents a kind of emotional, call it stability for that person, I'm not just going to counter it or let other people counter it unchecked or unchallenged. There's something driving that belief for that person about the need to acquire a certain kind of wealth to feel a certain kind of comfort. It's one thing to speak about what's called, what some people call public entitlements to mean things like certain healthcare benefits, and for that very same person to fall down some stairs, go to the hospital for free, be completely treated with no copay and no deductible, and then that same person come out and say, well, I think we need to look at cutting Medicare. Like, there's something very disingenuous about these ideas. So being real is about money can't buy you happiness, true, but the absence of it can make you miserable and unhealthy. My parents did the best they could. Now, this is often a state that people who've been through some kind of childhood abuse will arrive at over time. You know what? I can't blame my parents. They did the best they could. Okay. But there's a comma after that, not a period. And what follows the comma is this. And it wasn't good enough. People need that self-validation, right? To not rewrite history and somehow make abuse okay. Because what happens when the brain does that? Is that not part of the path toward recreating the problem? And I would argue yes. So what we need to do is validate the fact that it just wasn't good enough. But we're not blaming the parents. I don't do blame the parents therapy either. I'm very much about responsibility. To me, fault is not a conversation I have with people, but responsibility is always a conversation I will have. It's no one's fault necessarily they got abused, but that is your life. So it's your responsibility to figure out what you're going to do with it. Here's one that I like a lot. If you want change, you have to want it for yourself. I hear this a lot, particularly in the context of early recovery or addiction. If you want to change, you have to want it for yourself. Well, our own model of how change works, meaning the stages of change, completely counters that. Completely. What is the stages of change? Before you are aware of a problem, you are in what's called pre-contemplation. And then something happens, and it makes you aware that something you're doing is problematic. You are now in contemplation stage of change. And then as you're contemplating, you're thinking about, well, I'm going to make a change. What are my options? Like, what can I do differently, or who can I talk to? So now you're in this kind of like preparation stage where you're trying to figure out, again, like, what is your next step? The next stage is when you pick one of those things, and that's called the action stage. So, well, I don't know if I really have a problem with gambling, but I'll go talk to a therapist and see if I do. So you do that, right? That's the action stage. And the last stage is called maintenance. And this is where you keep doing the new thing that's working and maybe fixing problematic behavior. So you keep doing that new thing, maintenance. And then the phenomenon, okay, relapses and slips, and then the cycle, it just goes around and around and around. But here's the problem. If you want change, you have to want it for yourself. No. Why? Because most change is not like initiated by yourself. Most change at that stage of pre-contemplation is someone looking at you and saying, hey, Chris, that tie is from like 1990, buddy, like time to hit the store. And I look at it and I think, oh, yeah, I guess so. Like, I don't really pay attention. Thanks for letting me know, right? Somebody tells me there's something about me that ain't working. So I take a look at that. I look at my options. The initiation of change, it doesn't matter where it comes from. The maintenance stage, it actually does help to be invested in wanting that change. So when you realize that what you're doing new is better, then yes, if you want that change to sustain itself, then it kind of does matter to want that. Silence is golden. I only kind of threw that in here as kind of like a gimme for the people who do work with people, the art of talk therapy, right? Silence is golden. And not so much. Like silence in talk therapy is a very interesting and awkward moment, but many of us get trained to be comfortable with silence because we're often taught that silence can, and often is, by the way, your client kind of like processing something. They're just not talking yet or ready to respond to something. Absolutely. But how do you differentiate when someone is just staring back at you waiting to talk? Like, silence isn't always golden. Sometimes it's absolutely something else. So staying active in your talk therapy, the art of it is skillfully knowing how to check in with what the silence is about for people. This next one comes from, your type A's, and I don't mean that with any kind of judgment or diminishment. I have been accused of such myself, although I don't see it. Failure is not an option, okay? It's a sports thing, right? My perspective on that is, well, it darn well better be, because you're going to do it a lot. And if you don't do failure, then you're not being honest. Failure is also a thing with a comma after it, not a period. People that live with periods after things like failure and parents doing the best they could, they're stuck. They're stopping somewhere for whatever reason. Put commas after these statements. And it isn't about being, glib about, well, failure is just a stop on the way to success. Okay, say that, but make it mean something. This is the beauty of self-disclosure, particularly with certain populations. The narcissistic population, I love telling stories of failure to these folks. Why? Because you're role modeling that it's okay to fall down. It's okay to be stupid. It's okay to make no sense. It's okay to make mistakes. Like, none of that has to be self-defining, because if it becomes that, you run the risk, for crying out loud, of like, I don't know, making up narratives that no one else believes about the world, all because failure is not an option in your head. It needs to be not only an option, but an expectation, with an expectation of how to stand up. So failure is not just an option, it's an expectation. This next one, this is a little play on wordy. I get it. You're making me mad. You're going to drive me to drink. The play on words here is emotion versus behavior. So you're making me mad. I'm going to put a pause on that because you're going to drive me to drink is an easy one. We can't make people behave. That's not how things work. We can influence, we can ask, we can suggest, but you really can't make me go to Macy's and buy a new tie. I don't care how much you insult me, how much you insult the tie. You're not going to make me do that. You can emotionally threaten me and say, look, Chris, you're so clashy, you're going to drive me to drink. Well, go ahead then. Like, I can't make you not do that or do that, right? Take responsibility for your own behavior. However, you're making me mad. It's a pretty common trope in talk therapy, which, again, I don't judge. It has a place, but it has limits, enormous limits. When people will say, you can't make other people feel things. People choose to feel how they feel based on how they're thinking. Yes, however, in relationships, we're choosing to be vulnerable. We're choosing emotional vulnerability. So I allow myself to be influenced by you. So if I say you're making me mad, what I'm saying is I care about you, and you're distorting something to the point where I'm getting angry. I'm allowing you to influence how I feel. You are making me mad. Am I allowing you to make me mad? Of course I am, but you're also doing it. So when I tell you you're making me mad, I'm not trying to blame you for how I feel. I'm trying to tell you you're influencing me in a way that's causing conflict. So you're making me mad is a real thing. Evolving your style. I'm a huge fan of getting outside of the world of just talk therapy. Like, the books around here are largely about that, but I also have, maybe I can get it on the camera. Let's see. It's a fairly old book, and there's a couple of them. I'll throw it up there. The 776 stupidest things ever said. These are great quotes, typically from famous people. Dan Quayle, I love California. I grew up in Phoenix. I love this stuff. Like, finding comedy to reframe things for people. I watch a lot of stand-up and refer to it when I'm talking with people, because what do comics do that we find so fascinating? They take everyday stuff, generally speaking, and frame it in a way that manipulates us to laugh. That's brilliant. Like, that's just genius to me. Is that not the core of what we do? Not that we're trying to be stand-up comics with people. No. But does the creation of laughter help in talk therapy? A lot. Getting to see how comics work is interesting to me. If you want to know how to deal with resistance real well, or so-called non-compliant clients, or even confrontational difficult clients, watch a guy named Steve Hofstetter. He is one of the best comics at dealing with hecklers. It's amazing what he does. And when you watch how he intervenes with people, it's brilliant. 3 or 4 pat responses that you'll see in pattern, and then he kind of individualizes it for the situation. But he's great at it. Where else would I get my models? Well, from the world of debate, I watch a lot of debate. Why? Because I want to get good at recognizing the last point, logical fallacies. Like, the way people think influences, of course, how they think. And if you work with couples, you will see a lot of one particular logical fallacy. But if you don't know it, you can't label it. And if you can't label it, how do you talk about it, right? And what you end up seeing is what's called whataboutism. So if I'm in this couple scenario, I'm talking to my partner and say, I really can't stand the way you wash the dishes. And then, she says to me, well, I can't stand the way you drive. And all of a sudden, like this argument goes. And if the therapist doesn't intervene with the whataboutism, you're not going to affect change at all. But how do you recognize the logical fallacy? Well, you have to watch it in a situation where you're not expected to intervene. Debate. Virtual reality. What the heck is that? Well, that is me fishing in Korea, fishing in Japan. Last night I was in Korea and Japan fishing. Why? Because I'm on my couch listening to debate with a virtual reality headset on, and talking to people, by the way, like talking to people from California. I was talking to a guy from Calgary who knows more about American politics than I do. Crazy. Calgary, right? Like he knows politicians' names. Like that's bizarre. And I'm like, I can spell Calgary. Like I don't know a clue about Canadian politics. So what is that? That's about get out of your comfort zone. I'm not a gamer. I was never really into gaming, although I've played games. My son was always into it. So he got me tangentially interested a few years ago, pre-COVID, by showing me a Quest, like the virtual reality headset. And I thought, quirky, silly little thing, for gaming. And then COVID, and a year into COVID, and I'm going nuts like everybody else. And I kept reading about this thing about virtual reality and how you can talk to people. I thought, okay, cool, so I'll try it, and I did. And I haven't put it down since. But what does that really have to do with the art of talk therapy? Well, it's just an example of get out of what you're used to doing. Don't discount things because you've always discounted them. Take a look back at things and see if there's value. And by the way, virtual reality, if you start doing a little bit of research into it, you will find that there are studies in California and the UK at the leading edge of treating post-traumatic stress disorder using virtual reality. They're building 3D worlds and putting soldiers into these virtual worlds and doing talk therapy with them as they are re-experiencing their war experiences. Unbelievable. It's all virtual. So instead of sitting on a couch and just visually imagining or trying to remember a scenario, they're actually in it. They're watching the scenario unfold. This is the future, I believe, of many forms of talk therapy. There's a guy, Southern West, forget exactly where he's practicing. He's got a Twitter account, and all he does is virtual reality therapy with adolescents. That's what he does. And he talks about how he engages kids through the use of virtual reality. Fascinating. Politics, I threw that on there too, because again, finding your role models and resources from outside the field. The art of talk therapy is recognizing that we're people. Remember, there's two of us in the room. That's Jane, right? So I use Twitter for one reason only, and that is to clap back at people like Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Like, I just get kicks out of saying really inappropriate things to these people because they're in my head, and I want that stuff out of my head. That's me just being a person. And I will talk about that with clients. It's not sufficient to simply say, like, here's your anger management skills and look. No, we need outlets, right? And that's what I use Twitter for, just to clap back at people like that. Sorry for the politically involved people who might disagree with me. I'm more than happy to talk to you on Twitter. The last bullet point here, the struggle to keep it new. Change versus complacency. We all, as people, typically like to get complacent from time to time to mean this. There's a reason why every American home has a couch. We want to sit back, we want to relax and rest. And I tell people all the time, stop letting people judge you for not being constantly busy or constantly productive. Sorry to do the Don Jr. thing there. But the couch exists because we want to sit back. We want to be complacent, just relax, watch a little TV, right? But we need to be aware of the need for change too. Don't get so complacent that you're still having the same conversations today that you had, in 2010 and in 2015. Evolve your approach. Because again, what is our point today? Retaining people in the field. It's a lot of work to stay fresh, to stay relevant, but it's so worth it. In my view, when you do it outside of your field, through whatever category, whether it's politics or wherever you want to find new for you, find it and then incorporate it into the work that you do. The last couple of, and I'm respective of time, I only got like a minute to walk this through before questions. So I want to talk about quickly relationship math versus romantic math. because this matters. Math and talk therapy. I mentioned science earlier. Math does matter, but it's artistic math. I mean this. When you're working with couples, many of them come in with the social cliche of, two come together to become one. A partner will refer to their partner as my other half or my better half. All good. That's romantic math. It has its place. But in relationship math, 1 + 1 is 3. There's Bob, there's Sue, and there's their relationship. And if you don't address all three, as a couples therapist, you're going to get in trouble. So it isn't about 1 + 1 = 1. Don't get involved in that. Black, white, and gray. I fight back against the idea that in order to fight black and white, we need to be in the gray. My joke is I want the whole box of Crayola, all 64, and I want the sharpener in the back. Don't stick me in gray. It's way too monochromatic as I sit here with just a splash of pink on. I'm not going to go through the other details here, except for my very educated mother. This is a mnemonic for remembering the order of the planets. And Pluto is no longer a planet. So what do we do with the mnemonic? Nobody's bothered to change it, which I find funny. It's still the same mnemonic. We just have to remember to not add Pluto. Demoted in 2006 officially. And this last one, which I just added on from a guy named Matt Dillahunty. He's a debater, and he was talking about evidence and what is required for belief. So there's a saying, comes from Carl Sagan, by the way. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And he's a scientist. And he said, you know what? That's so not true. All claims require simply sufficient evidence. This is interesting because it's the use of hyperbole to make a point. And while Carl Sagan made his point, it got hijacked. And people take that over and then use and abuse his words to make points that he never intended Sagan to be said. So anyway, that's all I wanted to go through today. Be curious about things that you are taking for granted, perhaps, that keeps you, I think, fresh and interested in the field. And that's all I got. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was great. Feel free, if anyone has questions, to type them in the chat. I don't see any questions right now, but we'll give it a minute in case someone is working on one to put in. And just to also note, thank you, Amy, for coordinating, and thank you, everybody, for participating. Amy did paste the link to the evaluation in the chat box, so please take a minute to fill that out. We've also posted the registration links for our upcoming 2 trainings in April, so feel free to register for those as well. The recording of our presentation today will be posted on our webpage within the next couple days. And if you're interested in being a presenter, feel free to shoot Amy an email or put that on your evaluation. I'm just scrolling through to see if we have any questions here for you, Chris. I don't see any specific questions. One person commented that they were late, and I can let you know our training here was recorded, so it will be posted on our website. If you wanted to go back and review what you missed, you can check out our website when that is posted. I don't see any other questions, Chris. So as always, thank you so much, Chris, for a wonderful presentation. We're glad to have you. And thanks to everyone for being part of our collaborative.
Thank you.